Trench warfare is a type of combat in which both sides dig deep trenches in the ground to protect themselves from the enemy. The trenches of World War I could stretch for miles and made it nearly impossible for one side to advance on the other. Trench warfare was used on the Western Front in World War I, which was located in France. World War I began on June 28, 1914, and by the end of the year, both sides had dug trenches that ran from the North Sea through Belgium and France. For nearly 3.5 years, from October 1914 to March 1918, neither side gained much ground. During World War I, approximately 2,490 kilometers of trench lines were dug. The majority of trenches were 1 to 2 meters wide and 3 meters deep. Trenches were not excavated in straight lines. The trenches of World War I were built in a zigzag pattern with many different levels along the lines. They dug paths to allow soldiers to move between levels. Trenches were usually topped with an embankment and a barbed wire fence. During World War I, trenches were frequently reinforced with sandbags and wooden beams. The bottom of the trench was covered with wooden boards known as duckboards. These were designed to shield soldiers' feet from the water in the trenches, thereby preventing trench foot. Soldiers dug the trenches, and there were 3 methods for doing so. The soldiers would sometimes simply dig trenches straight into the ground, a technique known as entrenching. Entrenching was quick, but the soldiers were vulnerable to enemy fire while digging. Another possibility was to extend a trench on one end. It was known as sapping and was a safer method, but it took much longer. Tunneling, which involves digging a tunnel and then removing the roof to create a trench, was the safest method, but it was also the most difficult. Trenches needed to be repaired on a regular basis to prevent erosion from weather and enemy bombs and gunfire. It took 450 men 6 hours to construct approximately 250 meters of British trenches. The trenches were filthy and flooded in bad weather, making life extremely difficult. Pests such as rats, lice, and frogs were also found in many of the trenches. Rats, in particular, were a problem because they ate soldiers' food as well as the soldiers themselves while they slept. Lice also caused trench fever, a disease that made the soldiers itchy and caused fever, headaches, sore muscles, bones, and joints. Trench foot afflicted many soldiers who lived in the trenches. Rain and bad weather would flood the trenches, making them boggy and muddy, and could even obstruct weapons and make movement difficult during battle. Sustained exposure to wet, muddy conditions may result in trench foot, which may necessitate amputation of the foot. Cold weather was also dangerous, and soldiers frequently lost fingers or toes due to frostbite. Some soldiers died as a result of cold exposure. Soldiers were rotated through 3 frontline stages. The majority of soldiers would spend 1 day to 2 weeks in the trenches at a time. They spent time in the front lines, time in the support trenches, and time resting. Even when they weren't fighting, soldiers had to do things like repair trenches, move supplies, clean weapons, go through inspections, and stand guard. No Man's Land was the area between the 2 enemy trench lines. No Man's Land was occasionally encumbered with landmines and barbed wire. The distance between enemy trenches varied between 50 and 250 yards. sleeping in the trenches was difficult due to the noise and discomfort of the environment. Soldiers were always tired and on the verge of falling asleep. This is why the watch shift was limited to 2 hours to prevent men from falling asleep while on duty. Several ceasefires or truces were observed in the trenches during World War I. Around Christmas time in 1914, both British and German soldiers laid down their weapons, emerged from their trenches, exchanged gifts, and sang carols, effectively putting an end to the fighting. This is now referred to as the Christmas truce. The majority of World War I raids took place at night, when soldiers would sneak across no man's land, dodging mines, to attack the enemy in complete darkness. Soldiers would stand to every morning. Because many attacks take place first thing in the morning, this is when they stand up and prepare for battle. While fighting in the trenches, a typical World War I soldier would carry a rifle, bayonet, and a hand grenade.